She was used to the blows, used to the apologies that followed, used to believing she deserved it. But tonight, the night a mob boss walked through her door and saw blood on her lips, everything changed in a way neither of them could ever turn back. A ruthless killer who had murdered dozens without batting an eye. A girl who had learned to become invisible to survive. And a single question hung between them on that rainy Chicago night. Who was truly more dangerous? If you're reading this story, please like and comment with the city you're reading in so I know how far my story has progressed. Now, let's begin. The rain came down hard enough to blur the streetlights into smears of pink and gold against the wet asphalt, and Lucia Velez walked through it without an umbrella because she'd left hers on the 43rd floor of a building that wasn't hers, in a life that wasn't hers, cleaning marble floors she'd never be allowed to stand on as a guest. She was 24 years old, and she moved like someone older. Not elegant older, tired older. The kind of tired that settles into the joints and doesn't leave even after sleep, because sleep doesn't really come clean anymore either. Her sneakers were soaked through within the first block. She didn't bother running. Running required energy she'd stopped saving up a long time ago. The double shift had gone 11 hours. She'd started at 6 in the morning on the 14th floor. The Castellano suite, empty this week, windows smudged with city grime that needed 3 passes with the squeegee before the glass came clear. Then up to 43 for the Moretti penthouse, which always took longer because the man who owned it expected a level of clean that bordered on compulsive. Not that she'd ever met him in person. Nobody from the cleaning crew ever did. They left before his people arrived. That was the arrangement, and arrangements in this city were things you didn't question. She crossed Halsted Street against a red light because there were no cars coming, and because waiting felt like one more thing her body refused to do. The neighborhood she walked into wasn't dangerous the way outsiders thought dangerous looked. There were no obvious markers, no broken windows on every block, no groups loitering under street lamps. It was the quieter kind of danger, the kind that lived behind closed doors, where neighbors had learned not to listen too hard, and landlords had learned not to ask questions, and women like Lucia had learned to measure the temperature of a room the second they walked into it. She turned the key in the downstairs lock. She listened before she went up. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, and the stairwell had this particular quality of acoustics that she'd cataloged over 18 months of living there, the way sound carried differently depending on whether the door at the top was open or closed, the way the 3rd step creaked only when weight hit the left side of it, the way she could sometimes hear the television from the hallway and gauge from the volume alone what kind of night it was going to be. Tonight, the television was off. Lucia's hand tightened on the strap of her bag. She climbed slowly, keeping her weight to the right on the 3rd step, and stood outside the apartment door for 4 full seconds with her key in her hand before she turned it. 4 seconds was an old habit. Long enough to slow her breathing, long enough to remind herself that startling him was worse than walking in, long enough to make her face do the thing it needed to do. Neutral, soft, careful. The apartment was dark except for the kitchen light. Derek Hayes sat at the kitchen table with a glass in front of him and his phone face down beside it. And the way he was sitting, very still, very upright, shoulders squared, told her everything about what kind of night it already was before she'd even closed the door behind her. "Hey," she said. Quiet. Careful. He didn't answer. She set her bag down slowly, moved to the refrigerator because she needed something to do with her hands, and because having something to do with her hands made it easier not to let her eyes go to the glass. Derek drank beer when he was bored. He drank whiskey when something was wrong. The glass on the table was whiskey. "I texted you," he said. "I know, I was on the 43rd floor. We can't have phones out when we're in the... I texted you 3 hours ago." "I know." She kept her voice level. "I'm sorry, you couldn't answer your phone." He said it like he was reading a news article out loud, completely flat, for 3 hours. "Derek, where were you?" The question landed in the space between them, and Lucia felt the familiar recalibration happen inside her chest. The one where everything she was actually feeling got compressed down into something small and manageable and locked away. Because feelings right now would make this worse, and making this worse was the one thing she could not afford. "I was working," she said. "Same place I always am. You can call the building and ask." "I don't need to call anyone." He stood up. She didn't move. Moving backward had always made it worse faster. She'd learned that particular lesson with a cracked rib 14 months ago. And the lesson had stuck the way only certain kinds of lessons stick, written not in memory, but in the body's automatic responses, in the way her weight shifted subtly toward the counter to her left when he stood, finding something solid to brace against. Derek was 6'2" and broad through the shoulders, and had the kind of face that photographed well. Good jaw, easy smile. Which was the reason it had taken her so long to understand what lived underneath it. Handsome men, in her experience, had always been given the benefit of the doubt longer than they deserved. "You think I don't know?" he said. "Know what?" "Where you really are when you're gone." She felt the exhaustion fold into something sharper. "I'm cleaning apartments, Derek. That's it. That's the entire thing." Cleaning apartments. He laughed, but it wasn't a laugh. Not really. It was the shape of a laugh wrapped around something else entirely. "You come home late every other night smelling like whatever cologne those rich guys use, and I'm supposed to just... I smell like cleaning products. I smell like bleach and glass cleaner and 8 hours of sweat because that's what the job actually is." She heard her own voice go tight and tried to pull it back. "I'm tired. I'm really tired. Can we do this tomorrow?" "No," he said. "We can't." He moved around the table and she held still because holding still was the strategy. Had always been the strategy, if she could just stay calm and not escalate and not give him a reason. Then sometimes it didn't go all the way. Sometimes he just needed to hear himself talk for a while, and then it passed. Sometimes. "You think you're too good for me now," he said. It wasn't a question. It never was. "All those rich people you work for, all those penthouses. You think that's your life. You think you're going to end up there. That's not what I think. You look at me like I'm nothing. I don't. Like I'm beneath you. Derek, like I'm some piece of garbage you're stuck with while you wait for something better to come along." She made the mistake then. Not a big one. Not the kind of mistake that would look like anything from the outside. She just let a fraction of what she was feeling get into her eyes. Not anger, not even frustration. Just the bare, tired truth of standing here at 11:30 at night after 11 hours of physical labor being accused of things she hadn't done. And he saw it. He always saw it. She moved a step around him. He caught her by the arm and swung her sideways, hard enough that her hip connected with the kitchen counter, and she felt the edge of it dig in like a blade. Her elbow went out automatically to catch herself, and her palm slapped flat against the cabinet door, and she bit down on the sound that wanted to come out because sounds made it worse. "Don't walk away from me. Let go of my arm." "Don't you walk away." She twisted, trying to free her wrist, and he grabbed her by the shoulder, and the momentum of it shoved her into the counter again, different angle this time, and the back of her head caught the upper cabinet hard enough to white her vision for a moment. Her lip hit something, the edge of his hand, the cabinet corner. She couldn't track it exactly, and she tasted blood, warm and metallic, pooling at the corner of her mouth. She curled in on herself instinctively, arms coming up around her ribs, head dipping, making herself smaller, the body doing what it had been trained to do through repetition and pain. She'd cracked a rib once when she didn't protect them fast enough, and the memory of that lived somewhere below rational thought. Derek's hand came up. She closed her eyes, and then someone knocked on the door. No, not knocked. The sound was too heavy, too deliberate for knocked. It was the kind of sound that a door makes when the person on the other side has already decided it's going to open whether you answer or not. 3 impacts that shook the frame. Derek froze. Lucia opened her eyes. The knock came again, same force, same rhythm, patient in a way that was somehow more frightening than urgency would have been. Derek looked at the door, looked at her. "You expecting someone?" "No." He straightened, let go of her arm, ran a hand over his face. Quick, automatic, the gesture of a man reassembling a version of himself that looked like nothing was wrong. He was good at that. She'd always found that particular skill of his more disturbing than anything else he was capable of. "Go sit down," he told her. She stayed where she was. He crossed the apartment and opened the door. The man who stood in the hallway didn't belong in this building. That was the first thing Lucia's brain registered, even through the ringing in her ears and the throb in her lip. The sheer wrongness of him being here, in this hallway, in front of this door. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than Lucia made in 4 months. Black jacket, no tie, shirt open at the collar. He stood with the stillness of someone who had not needed to fill space with movement for a very long time. 2 men stood behind him in the hallway, both larger than Derek, both watching the interior of the apartment with the flat attention of people who were not surprised by very much. Lucia knew the face. She'd never spoken to him directly, never been in the same room. But you didn't clean a man's penthouse twice a week without learning his face from photographs, from the kind of whispered information that circulated among the building staff. Careful, quiet information shared in the service corridors and the staff break room with the specific energy of people who understood that certain knowledge was both necessary and dangerous. Matteo Moretti, 41 years old, owner of 3 commercial towers, 6 restaurants, a private equity firm, and according to the whispers, a significant portion of the city's criminal infrastructure. A name that made building managers straighten their spines and building security look at their shoes. A name that the woman on Lucia's crew, Camila, always lowered her voice to say, the way people used to speak about weather events, with a kind of reverent fatalism that accepted power as a force of nature rather than a choice. He stood in her doorway, and his eyes moved through the apartment with a single, unhurried sweep. And Lucia watched him take inventory the way she took inventory of a room when she first walked into it, noting what was out of place, what had been disturbed, what the surfaces told you about what had been happening before you arrived. Broken glass on the kitchen floor from a cup that had gone off the counter when she hit the cabinet, blood on her mouth, the positioning of her body, sideways, arms still slightly raised, spine pressed against the cabinet like she'd been trying to get through it. Mr. Moretti. Derek's voice had shifted into something she recognized, the performance of normalcy, pitched at exactly the volume and register of someone who had nothing to hide precisely because they had too much to hide. I don't think we've met. I'm Derek Hayes. I'm Lucia's mom. I know who you are, Matteo said. He said it without looking at Derek. He was still looking at the kitchen, at the glass on the floor, at Lucia's lip. Derek stepped sideways, partially blocking the doorway. Not enough to seem aggressive, just enough. Is there something I can help you with? It's pretty late. Miss Velez left something in the building. Lucia blinked. Derek glanced back at her. That true? She had left nothing in the building. She was absolutely certain of that. She was the kind of person who checked twice, who had learned through experience that leaving things behind meant returning for them, and returning meant more time in places where she didn't belong and couldn't afford to cause problems. She started. It's been secured at the front desk, Matteo said, still addressing the room more than either of them. I prefer to return valuables personally. The lie was effortless, not even elaborate, just dropped into the room like a stone into water, with enough weight that the ripples moved out from it and nobody said the obvious thing, which was that billionaires did not personally return lost property to the apartments of their janitorial staff at 11:30 on a Thursday night. Derek stared at him. Matteo finally looked at Derek directly. And something happened in that moment that Lucia, despite everything she was feeling, watched with a kind of involuntary attention. She'd seen men try to stare Derek down before. He was physically intimidating, had a particular quality of coiled readiness that most people picked up on and stepped back from. He had never, in Lucia's experience, been the one who looked away first. Derek looked away in 4 seconds. I'll give you a minute, he said to Lucia, and walked to the bedroom and closed the door, which was so thoroughly unlike him that Lucia just stood there for a moment processing it, while Matteo stepped into the apartment and his 2 men positioned themselves in the doorway without being asked to. Matteo walked to the kitchen. Not toward her. He stopped about 6 feet away, which was close enough to speak quietly, but far enough that she hadn't had to move or back up to maintain distance. And she registered that calculation even through everything else that was happening, because it was the kind of consideration that people who meant harm didn't typically bother with. He looked at her lip. When did that happen? He asked. I fell. The words came out automatic, preloaded, the way certain responses become so practiced they detach from thought entirely. She heard herself say it and felt the particular shame of it. Not the shame of the lie itself, but the shame of how easy it was, how reflexively she reached for it, how thoroughly she'd internalized the performance. Matteo said nothing for a moment. "You fell," he said finally. "It's not... How long?" Not a question. The same flat, declarative energy that he'd used with Derek. Like he already knew the answer and was offering her the opportunity to say it out loud rather than making her feel interrogated. Lucia's throat tightened. "I don't know what Your right wrist," he said. "Old bruising, approximately 10 to 14 days old. There's something wrong with the way you're holding your left side. You moved your arm out to catch yourself when you hit the cabinet and then brought it back fast, like it cost you. Cracked or bruised rib, not recent. The muscle memory when he came close..." He stopped. "You've been doing this a long time." She stared at him. "How long?" he said again. Her mouth was dry. The blood was still there at the corner of her lip, and she could taste it, and she was standing in her own kitchen being quietly dissected by a man she'd never spoken to before, who apparently cataloged other people's damage the way she cataloged dirty surfaces, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. The dangerous, destabilizing sensation of being actually seen. 18 months, she said. The words came out almost without her permission. Give or take. Matteo was quiet. Then, "Do you want to leave?" The directness of it hit her like the cold air from an open window. Not, "Do you need help?" Not, "Let me know if there's anything I can do." Not the usual circling language that people used when they wanted to offer something without committing to it. Just the question, clean and unambiguous. And she realized he was asking because he was genuinely prepared for either answer. "I have my grandmother," she said. "She lives with me. She can't... She comes too." Lucia looked at him. Really looked at him. Not the quick processing glances she'd been managing since he walked in. His face was difficult to read. Not because it was blank, but because it had too much compressed into too small a space. The way a city looks from altitude. All that complexity flattened into a single surface. There were lines around his eyes that came from something other than laughter. His hands were still at his sides, and they were not the hands of a man who spent his days managing equity portfolios, regardless of what his company website said. "Why are you here?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment that stretched out one beat longer than comfortable. "One of my people flagged an incident in the building earlier this week," he said. "Security footage from the parking structure. You were followed to your car by someone. The footage captured enough to run a background." She didn't say anything. She remembered the night he was talking about. A man she hadn't recognized standing near the elevator bank when she came off shift, following at a distance that was just close enough. She'd told herself she was being paranoid. She'd taken the long way to her car and then spent 20 minutes sitting in the parking structure, convincing herself it was nothing. "We identified him as connected to someone in Derek Hayes' network," Matteo said. "The situation became relevant to building security." "Building security," she repeated. "Yes." She looked at him. "That's not the real reason," she said. The corner of his mouth shifted. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one, maybe. "No," he said. "It's not." From the bedroom, the sound of the television coming on. Volume too loud. The specific kind of loud that was meant to signal presence and displeasure simultaneously. Matteo glanced toward the bedroom door. Lucia saw something move through his expression. Not anger, exactly. Anger was too warm for what it was. More like the absolute zero of a decision being made at a temperature below anything she had a name for. "He followed her," one of the men in the doorway said quietly. He was looking at his phone. "To the building. 3 times in the past month. He's been running the plate on the car she takes home." Derek had been tracking her. The information landed in Lucia's chest and sat there. She'd known he was controlling. She'd known he monitored her texts, knew approximately where she was at any given time, had preferences about which routes she took home and which of her coworkers she spoke to. She'd filed those things away as things she managed rather than things she was afraid of, because being afraid of them meant admitting something about her situation that she hadn't been ready to admit. The bedroom door opened. Derek came out with his hands in his pockets and his face arranged back into something that passed for casual if you didn't know what you were looking for, and looked at Matteo with the specific kind of hostility that men performed when they felt their territory was being entered but couldn't afford to be direct about it. I think we're good here, he said. Whatever she left behind, she's got it now. We're good. Matteo looked at him. Right, Derek said, looked at Lucia. Right? And this was the moment. Lucia knew it was the moment even while she was standing in it. The kind of moment that would live in her memory with a clarity that other moments didn't have, the way certain things get burned in. Not because they were the worst things, but because they were the things where the choice was visible. She could say yes. She was good at saying yes. She'd been saying yes and fine, and it's nothing, and I fell for 18 months, and the machinery of that was well-oiled and automatic, and the alternative was a terrifying open space she couldn't see the edges of. She looked at Matteo. He wasn't looking at Derek anymore. He was looking at her, waiting. And the waiting had no pressure in it, no expectation, no impatience, nothing that said she owed him one answer or the other. Just stillness, which was its own kind of answer about the kind of person he was, or the kind of person he was performing being, and she wasn't sure yet which one it was, and she wasn't sure it mattered. Derek stepped toward her. Not fast, just moved, the way he always moved when he wanted to be between her and an exit, casually repositioning like it wasn't a positioning at all. One of the men in the doorway put his hand on Derek's chest. Not hard, just there, immovable. Derek looked at the hand, looked at the man, looked at Matteo, and in his eyes, Lucia could see the moment the calculus completed, and he understood something about the situation that changed the temperature of the room entirely. "This is my apartment," Derek said. His voice had gone somewhere low and controlled. "This is my home. You don't have any right." "Go sit down," Matteo said. Derek stared at him. Matteo said nothing else. He didn't have to. Something in the quality of the silence that followed communicated with a precision that no threat could have matched. That the options available in this room had narrowed to exactly two, and one of them was significantly worse than the other. Derek sat down. Lucia felt the breath leave her body in a way that was almost disorienting. The sudden absence of the tension she'd been holding so constantly that she'd stopped feeling it as tension, and had started feeling it as just the baseline sensation of existing. Matteo turned back to her. "Your grandmother," he said. "She's in the back room?" "Yes." Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "She sleeps early." "All right." He looked at his watch, then at her. "Take what you need. 10 minutes. And the thing that undid her, not the intervention, not the physical safety of the men in the doorway, not the clean directness of being asked rather than managed. The thing that actually cracked something open inside Lucia Velez was what he said next, quiet enough that Derek couldn't hear it from across the room. "Take your time," Matteo said. "There's no rush." No rush. 3 words that no one had said to her in 18 months, maybe longer. She went to get Sophia. She went to get Sophia, and she didn't look back at Derek because if she looked at him, she would second-guess herself. And if she second-guessed herself, she would stay. And if she stayed, she already knew how the rest of the story went, because she'd already been living the rest of that story for a year and a half. And she knew every beat of it, every apology and flower and broken glass. Sophia was 71 and had bad hips and came awake the way old women did, instantly, completely, with no transition period between sleep and full awareness. She looked at Lucia's lip and her face did something complicated, and she didn't ask questions, which was its own kind of grace, just reached for her robe and her slippers and took Lucia's hand and let herself be helped up from the bed. "Donde vamos?" she whispered. "I don't know," Lucia said honestly. "Somewhere else." Sophia squeezed her hand. "Bueno." They came out of the bedroom to find Matteo standing exactly where Lucia had left him, and Derek sitting at the kitchen table looking at his phone with the rigid stillness of a man trying very hard to appear unconcerned, and the 2 men in the doorway who hadn't moved. Matteo looked at Sophia. Something shifted in his face. Brief, involuntary, gone before Lucia could fully catalog it. "Mrs.?" he said. "Reyes," Sophia said, and looked at him with the particular unflinching assessment of a woman who had been alive long enough to have no patience for pretense. "You're going to look after my granddaughter?" Matteo held her gaze without blinking. "Yes." Sophia looked at him for another long moment. Then she looked at Lucia. Then she looked back at Matteo. "Good," she said simply, and walked toward the door. They moved through the hallway, down the stairs, out into the rain that was still coming down hard enough to blur the streetlights. A black SUV waited at the curb with its engine running. One of the men opened the rear door and helped Sophia in. Lucia stood on the sidewalk. She was wet within seconds. She didn't move. Mateo came to stand beside her, not under an umbrella, just in the rain. "What happens now?" she asked. "I take you somewhere safe." "And then?" He was quiet for a moment. "I handle the problem," he said. Something in the way he said it made the air between them go very still, despite the rain. She looked at him sideways. "What does that mean?" He looked at her, and for just a moment the surface of his expression did something she couldn't read. Too deep, too compressed, too far down. "It means Derek Hayes will not follow you," he said. She should have asked more questions. She knew that. She knew who this man was, or what the whispers said he was, knew that the particular way he'd phrased that sentence had implied a certainty that went beyond restraining orders and police reports. She knew that getting into that car was trading one kind of dangerous for another kind, that the distance between Derek's violence and Matteo Moretti's version of the world might not be the distance between danger and safety, so much as the distance between a fire she knew and a fire she hadn't yet learned the shape of. She got in the car. Sophia was already asleep against the window by the time they pulled away from the curb, the way elderly people sometimes could sleep through crisis because they'd lived long enough to understand that crisis was simply weather, and you rode it out and you kept going. Lucia sat straight and watched the city move past the window and felt the specific kind of exhaustion that came after adrenaline. Not just tired, but hollowed out. All the mechanisms that had been running on high suddenly idling in a space they didn't know yet. She didn't notice when they stopped at the light on Michigan Avenue. She didn't notice Matteo watching her reflection in the glass. She didn't notice him pick up his phone. She heard 3 words. "Handle it tonight." And then the light changed, and the city kept moving, and somewhere behind them, in an apartment on the 3rd floor of a building on Halsted Street, Derek Hayes sat at a kitchen table with a whiskey glass and had absolutely no idea that the world as he knew it had just ended while he was trying to look at his phone like none of this mattered. Morning came cold and gray and brought with it a brownstone on the north side with a security panel on every door and a man posted at the entrance and actual locks that worked. The kind of building where the neighbors didn't stare and the hallways didn't have the particular quality of listening that Lucia had grown accustomed to. Sophia declared the bed excellent and went back to sleep. Lucia stood at the kitchen window of the 3rd floor unit and looked at the street below and drank the coffee someone had left in a thermos on the counter. Black, strong, still hot, and tried to process the last 9 hours of her life. She couldn't. She could process the immediate things. The lip was swollen, but not split badly enough to need stitching. Her ribs ached from the counter, but it was old ache layered over old ache, familiar, manageable. She'd slept approximately 4 hours on a mattress with no springs poking through it, which was a luxury she hadn't realized she'd stopped expecting. What she couldn't process was the rest of it. A knock at the door. Soft, measured. Nothing like the pounding that had ended the night before. She crossed the apartment and opened it. Matteo stood in the hallway in different clothes. Dark sweater, dark pants. He looked like he hadn't slept, but it sat on him differently than tiredness sat on other people. Like it had been factored in, like the body had simply recalibrated around it. He held a paper bag. "Food," he said. "For your grandmother when she wakes up." Lucia looked at the bag, looked at him. The instinct, the old automatic instinct, was to say, "No thank you, I'm fine, we're fine, we don't need anything." The instinct was 18 months of conditioning wrapped around a deeper layer of years of being someone who didn't want to owe anything to anyone because owing things to people gave them leverage, and leverage was how things went wrong. She took the bag. "Thank you," she said. Matteo nodded. He didn't move to come in, didn't give any indication of expecting to be invited in. Just stood there with his hands in his pockets in the hallway and looked at her with that expression she couldn't fully read. "You need to see a doctor," he said. "I'm fine." "Your rib." She held his gaze. "I know what cracked ribs feel like. I know how to manage it." "That's not the same as fine." "No," she agreed, "but it's what I've got." He studied her for a moment, then, There's a doctor who comes here, doesn't use official records, if you want. She thought about that, about what it meant that he had a doctor who didn't use official records, what that said about the ecosystem of services he maintained, what the shape of his world actually looked like up close rather than from the distance of a penthouse she cleaned twice a week. "I'll think about it," she said. "All right." He turned to go. "Moretti." He stopped. She didn't know why she'd said it. The word had just come out. Not his first name, not the formal Mr. Moretti of the building staff who had to manage their own proximity to power. Just the name. Like he was a person she was addressing rather than a thing she was navigating. He turned back. She looked at him, and the morning light was gray through the window at the end of the hallway, and it fell on his face at an angle that showed her things she hadn't fully registered in the chaos of the night before. The set of his jaw, the particular quality of exhaustion around his eyes, that was not the exhaustion of lost sleep, but something older and more structural. The way he held himself like someone who had made peace long ago with carrying weight that other people put down. "Why did you come last night?" she said. "Actually," the silence stretched out. "I saw the footage," he said. "You said that." "The parking structure," he paused. "I watched it twice." Another pause. Longer. "The way you walked to your car. The way you kept checking behind you and then making yourself stop checking, like you decided it was better not to know." He stopped, looked at the floor briefly, looked back at her. "I recognized it." Lucia was very still. "My mother," he said simply, not elaborating, not explaining, just placing the words in the space between them like stones in water and letting them settle. She didn't say anything. He nodded once, small, self-contained, a gesture that said the conversation had gone exactly as far as it needed to, and walked down the hallway toward the stairs. Lucia closed the door and leaned her back against it. Outside the window, the gray morning moved slowly over the city and somewhere across town. She knew without knowing how, the problem that was Derek Hayes was being handled. She thought she should feel more about that than she did. She thought she should feel something clean and certain. Relief or guilt, or the specific horror of understanding what kind of man had just intervened in her life and what he was capable of on her behalf. She felt all of those things. She also felt, underneath them all, something she hadn't felt in so long it took her a moment to identify it. Safe. And that was the most dangerous feeling of all, she knew, because safety could be taken away. Safety could be a performance. Safety could be the setup for something worse, and she had no evidence yet that this particular safety was anything other than temporary, conditional, the prelude to a transaction she didn't understand yet. But it was there. Warm and quiet and entirely without precedent. She drank the rest of the coffee. She didn't know yet that 6 blocks away, in a parked car outside the building where she worked, someone had been watching the brownstone since 3 a.m, taking photographs with a telephoto lens, sending them somewhere. She didn't know yet that Matteo Moretti had an enemy far more patient and far more dangerous than Derek Hayes had ever dreamed of being. She didn't know yet that by bringing her here, by breaking his own cardinal rule about keeping his private world and his public violence in separate compartments, Matteo had done something he couldn't undo. She had become visible. And in the world Matteo Moretti lived in, visible meant targeted. She would find all of that out. But not yet. Right now, the coffee was still warm, and Sophia was sleeping, and the rain had stopped sometime in the night. And for the first time in 18 months, Lucia Velez woke up in a place where she wasn't afraid of the sound of a door opening. That, for now, was enough. 3 days passed before Lucia saw Matteo again. 3 days of learning the geometry of the brownstone, which floorboards creaked near the bathroom, which window in the kitchen faced east and caught the morning light longest, which of the 2 men posted downstairs was the one who drank his coffee black, and which one took it with enough sugar to qualify as dessert. Small details. The kind of details she cataloged automatically, had been cataloging automatically for years, because knowing the details of a space was how you knew when something in it changed. The space was safe. The space was also not hers, and those 2 facts sat beside each other uncomfortably, the way 2 true things sometimes did. Sophia adapted with the pragmatic ease of someone who had survived enough upheaval to understand that comfort was portable. She'd commandeered the kitchen by the second morning, establishing territorial rights through the medium of sofrito and a cast iron pan she'd apparently found in a cabinet, and declared superior to anything she'd owned in the previous apartment. She cooked. She watched her telenovelas on a tablet someone had left for her. She asked Lucia no questions about what had happened or who these people were or what came next, and Lucia loved her with an intensity that sometimes felt like a physical weight, because Sophia's silence was not the silence of not understanding. It was the silence of someone who understood completely and had decided that understanding was not the same as needing to speak. On the fourth morning, a knock came at the door at 7:15. Lucia was already up. She slept early now and woke early, a recalibration her body had made without being asked, like it understood that in a safe place, sleep was something you could afford to do properly, and it was making up for lost time. She opened the door in yesterday's sweatshirt with a mug in her hand. Matteo was alone. That registered first. No men behind him, no visible infrastructure of protection and threat. Just him in a dark coat with water on the shoulders from the morning mist, holding a paper bag from a bakery she didn't recognize. "Walk?" he said. She looked at him, looked at the bag, looked at the gray morning through the window at the end of the hall. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. They walked along the lakefront, where the wind came off the water with the specific cold authority of early November, and the path was mostly empty except for a few runners who moved past with the focused inward attention of people who had made agreements with themselves about suffering. Matteo walked with his hands in his coat pockets. Lucia walked with hers wrapped around the coffee he'd brought from the bakery bag, which was better coffee than she'd had in months, and which she wasn't going to comment on because commenting on it felt like conceding something. "The doctor," he said. "Did you see him?" "Yesterday." "And?" "Ribs bruised, not cracked, I told you." "You told me you could manage it." "Same thing." He glanced at her sideways, said nothing. They walked another half-block in silence. A jogger passed going the other direction. The lake was dark gray and restless, small whitecaps catching what little light the clouds were allowing through. "Derek," she said. Matteo kept walking. "What happened to him?" "He's alive," Matteo said. "If that's what you're asking." "That's not exactly what I was asking." "I know." She let that sit for a moment. The wind lifted her hair and she pushed it back with one hand and looked out at the water and thought about the version of herself that had spent 18 months arranging her face into something acceptable before walking through her own front door, and felt something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger and didn't have a clean name. "He left the city," Matteo said. "He was encouraged to do so." "Encouraged?" "Yes." "By who?" "People I know." She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead, profile sharp against the gray sky, and there was something in the set of his jaw that communicated very clearly that this was the edge of what he was going to say about it, and that pressing further would not change that. "Okay," she said. "You're not going to ask more than that?" "Would you tell me more than that?" A pause. "No." "Then okay." He looked at her then, briefly, with something she couldn't fully catalog. Not surprise exactly, more like the minor recalibration of an expectation, like he'd been prepared for a different conversation and was adjusting in real time. They walked to the end of the path and turned back, and the wind was behind them now, and easier, and Lucia finished the coffee and held the empty cup because there was no trash can. "I need to go back to work," she said. Matteo was quiet for 3 steps. "Not yet." "I can't just—" "It's not safe yet." She stopped walking. He stopped too, a half-beat later, and turned to face her, and she looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for people who were about to learn that her compliance had limits, which was an expression she hadn't had much occasion to use in the past 18 months, and which felt, she realized, almost good to locate again. "I have a job," she said. "I have rent that I'm behind on, even though I'm apparently not currently living there. I have a grandmother who needs her medication refilled next week, and I have a life, Moretti. An actual life. Not much of one, but it's mine. I don't stay inside and wait because someone decides it's not safe." He held her gaze. "The man in the parking structure," he said. "He wasn't one of Derek's people." She felt the cold come in. "What?" "I told you he was. That was—" He paused. A simplification. Who was he? The wind off the lake, a runner, the distant sound of a bus on the street behind them. His name is Cade Merritt, Matteo said. He works for a man named Salvatore Vesci, who is, I know who Salvatore Vesci is. Everyone in the city knew who Salvatore Vesci was, the same way everyone knew certain weather events by name, the ones with enough force to earn them. Why is someone from Vesci's organization following me? Matteo looked at her steadily. Because they found out you work for me. The sentence arrived and Lucia stood with it for a moment, feeling the full weight of what it meant. Not just its surface meaning, but its structural meaning, the architecture beneath it. She worked in his building. She cleaned his penthouse. In whatever calculation Vesci was running, that proximity was enough to make her a variable. She had become part of a war she didn't know was happening. How long have they been watching me? She asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was its own kind of muscle memory. We don't know. At least 2 weeks before I had you brought here. She turned away from him and looked at the lake for a moment. Breathed. The water was going nowhere fast the way large things didn't. Just moving within itself. Surface churn over something much deeper and more constant. You should have told me that first, she said. Yes, he said. No qualification. No explanation attached, just yes. She turned back. I'm not an asset, Moretti. I'm not collateral. I'm not a piece of something you're managing. I know that. Then talk to me like it. Something moved in his face, brief and complicated and gone quickly, but she caught the edge of it. Not offense, not defensiveness. Something more like recognition. Like she'd said a thing he'd been expecting someone to say for a long time and had stopped anticipating. All right, he said. They went back to the brownstone. The meeting happened at 2 p.m. in a room on the second floor that had been set up as something between an office and a war room. A long table, several laptops, maps of the city's north side districts pinned to a corkboard with colored markers indicating things Lucia didn't have the context to decode. 3 men she hadn't seen before sat around the table. One of them, heavy-set, 50s, with the specific watchfulness of someone who measured threat for a living, looked at her when she walked in with Matteo, and then looked at Matteo with a question in his face that he didn't ask out loud. She stays, Matteo said. The heavy-set man, Matteo called him Russo, no first name, laid it out without editorial. Vesci had been expanding operations into the north side for 8 months. Moretti infrastructure in 3 neighborhoods had been disrupted. Supply chains, protection arrangements, 2 business owners who'd been paying Moretti taxes and had been visited by Vesci's people and presented with a different offer. Standard territorial pressure, the kind that preceded something larger. And then he found her, Russo said, nodding at Lucia with the economy of a man who did not spend words on sentiment. Found me doing what? Lucia said. Russo looked at Matteo. Answer her, Matteo said. Russo shifted in his chair. Vesci's been looking for a way to get Matteo personally invested. Not just business, personal. He had people watching the building, your building, for anyone Matteo took a specific interest in. A pause. You moved here, under Matteo's arrangement. His men, his building. That's visible to people who know how to look. So he thinks I matter to you, Lucia said to Matteo. Matteo said nothing. Do I? She said. The room was very quiet. Yes, Matteo said. Not elaborated, not qualified. The same clean, undecorated honesty he'd used when Sophia asked him whether he'd look after her granddaughter, and Lucia sat with it and felt the discomfort of it, and the strange, specific weight of being told by a man like this that she mattered, and not knowing what to do with that information. Then we have a problem, she said. We have a problem, he agreed. One of the other men at the table, younger, lean, with a scar that ran through his left eyebrow, slid a photograph across the table toward Matteo without speaking. Matteo looked at it, and his face did the thing Lucia was beginning to recognize. The compression, everything going inward and still, like a building whose windows all go dark at once. He turned the photograph over. She didn't ask to see it. She asked anyway. He was quiet for a moment. Then he passed it across the table to her. It was a photograph of her, coming out of a grocery store 3 blocks from the brownstone, taken with a telephoto lens from somewhere elevated, timestamp on the lower corner, 2 days ago. On the back, handwritten in blue ink, "Every bruise you hide belongs to me now." Lucia set the photograph down. Her hands were steady. She was actually a little surprised by that. "This is a threat to me," she said. "Or to you." "Both," Russo said. "What does he want?" "To make Matteo make a mistake," Russo said. "Angry men make mistakes." Lucia looked at Matteo. He was looking at the back of the photograph, at the handwriting. The quality of attention he was paying it was the kind she associated with things that were trying very hard to contain themselves. "You're angry," she said. "Yes." "Are you going to make a mistake?" He looked up at her. The eye contact was very direct, and she didn't look away from it, and the room around them seemed to contract slightly, the other men receding to background noise. "Not if I can help it," he said. Russo cleared his throat. "We need to move her again. Different location, smaller footprint. The brownstone's been compromised if he got that photo." "She's not a package," Matteo said. "Flat, final. Matteo, she decides." Russo looked at Lucia, not with hostility, with the professional assessment of a man who had learned to adapt his expectations. "We have a place in Evanston," he said to her. "Smaller, easier to secure. Your grandmother would be comfortable." "For how long?" Lucia asked. "Until we resolve the situation with Vesci." "How long is that?" Russo and Matteo exchanged a look that had a whole conversation inside it. "Honest answer," she said. "Weeks," Russo said. "Maybe more." She looked at the ceiling briefly, thought about Sophia's cast iron pan, thought about the university application she had half filled out on her phone 3 months ago and never submitted, thought about the version of her life that had existed before last Thursday night and what it would have looked like in 6 months, 12 months, 5 years, and the answer to that question was not a comfortable one to sit with. "Okay," she said. "Evanston." Russo nodded and went back to the map. Lucia looked at Matteo. He was watching her with an expression she'd been slowly learning to read across 4 days of proximity. Still complicated, still compressed, but she was beginning to be able to separate the layers. There was the operational layer, the constant low-level threat assessment that lived behind his eyes like a pilot light. There was something beneath that which was harder to name, older, quieter, the kind of thing that didn't get looked at directly. She was beginning to understand that Matteo Moretti was a man who had spent a long time making sure no one looked at it directly. She looked at it directly. He didn't look away. They moved to Evanston that evening. The new place was smaller, a 2-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a building that looked like any other building on the block. 2 men outside instead of 4. Less infrastructure, less visible. Sophia found the kitchen smaller, but the bedroom window had a view of a garden that was brown and dormant in November, but would, she announced with certainty, be worth looking at in the spring. Lucia didn't tell her not to plan for spring. She didn't have the heart. Matteo came by the second evening. He came alone again, which she'd noticed was a pattern, that when he came to see her specifically, rather than for operational reasons, he didn't bring the apparatus of his world with him. He sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee Sophia immediately produced because Sophia appeared to have decided that feeding people was her personal method of addressing complex situations. And Lucia sat across from him and they talked for 2 hours in a way that was almost aggressively ordinary. She told him about the university application, the unsubmitted one. Social work, she said, specifically domestic abuse advocacy, though she'd never said that out loud to anyone before, and the sound of it in the kitchen felt strange, like saying it made it real, and making it real made it also possible, and possible was a concept she'd been keeping at arm's length for a while. He listened, didn't comment, didn't offer money or connections or any of the things she'd been tensed for him to offer, the things that would have made this transactional and manageable and far less disorienting. She asked him about the business, the real business, not the equity firm on the website. He was quiet for a moment, then he told her. Not everything. She understood she wasn't getting everything, but enough. The structure of it, the territories, the network of arrangements that kept the city's underground economy organized and predictable. The men at the top of competing organizations who had found it more profitable to have Moretti as a known quantity than to dismantle him and deal with the chaos of what followed. A world of maintained equilibriums that required regular violence to stay in balance, which was its own kind of logic, even if it was a logic built on things she found genuinely horrifying. "Does it bother you?" she asked. "What you are?" He looked at his coffee cup for a long moment. "It used to bother me more." "What changed?" "I got better at it." She looked at him. "That's not an answer," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." The honesty of that disarmed her more than any explanation would have. She'd expected deflection, or the kind of dark romanticism that men in violent worlds sometimes wrap themselves in. The tortured anti-hero narrative, the complexity as aesthetic. Instead, he'd just acknowledged the inadequacy of what he'd said and sat with it, which was the behavior of someone who'd made peace with certain things about himself and wasn't asking for absolution. She didn't know what to do with a man who wasn't asking for absolution. She was still trying to figure it out 3 days later when she found the photograph. She hadn't been in Mateo's coat pocket looking for it. She'd found his coat left over a chair when she came down the hallway after he'd stepped outside to take a call, and it had slipped to the floor. And when she picked it up, something fell from the inner pocket. A photograph. Old, worn at the corners. A woman in her 40s with dark hair and Mateo's jaw and an expression on her face that told you exactly nothing about what she was feeling, which told you everything. Lucia held the photograph and heard Mateo's voice in her head. "My mother." Just those 2 words, placed in the hallway outside a brownstone door like an offering he hadn't quite meant to make. She heard his footsteps on the stairs. She set the photograph on the table face up. He came in and saw it and went very still. "It fell," she said. "I know." He crossed to the table and picked it up. Held it for a moment, looking at it with the particular expression of someone revisiting a place they don't go to often and don't particularly want to be right now. "She left when I was 11, he said. Not to Lucia specifically, to the kitchen, to the photograph, to the question that had been hanging in the air since the night on the lakefront. "Not left, was removed. My father's work had a cost. She paid most of it." A pause. "I found her when I was 26. She'd been living under a different name in Tucson for 15 years. Lucia sat very still. "She was fine," he said. "She'd built a whole other life. Good one." He set the photograph down. "She didn't want to see me. I reminded her of things." He said it without self-pity, which was somehow harder to hear than self-pity would have been. Self-pity had edges you could push against. This was just a fact, delivered flatly, the way certain kinds of damage eventually got delivered. Not because the pain had gone out of it, but because the person carrying it had learned to carry it at a level below expression. "I'm sorry," Lucia said. "Don't be." He looked at her. "I'm telling you because you asked me why I came that night. The real reason." "I know the real reason." "I don't think you do entirely." She held his gaze. "You recognize the way I walked to my car." "Yes. And I recognized—" He stopped, started again. "When you said, 'Please don't hit me,' and you were looking at me, not at him, at me." She'd forgotten she'd said that. Or, not forgotten. Filed it away in the category of things she'd rather not examine too closely, because examining them meant acknowledging the extent to which the conditioning went, how deep it had gotten, the way 18 months of one kind of fear had rewired her threat assessment so thoroughly that a strange man walking into her apartment had landed in the same category as the one who'd been hurting her all along. "That wasn't about you," she said. "I know. That's exactly why." He looked at her steadily. "Because it meant you'd gotten to a place where it didn't matter who the man was. They were all the same threat. And I—" A pause that had something working in it. "I did not want to be that." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a car passed, then nothing. "You're not," she said. He looked at her. "You're not the same threat," she said. "You're a different kind of complicated, but not that." Something happened in his face. She watched it happen. Brief, involuntary, real, in the way that only completely unguarded things were real. It was gone in a second. But she'd seen it. His phone rang. He answered it immediately, and she watched his face change the way it changed when the operational layer came back online. All the compression, all the control, snapping back into place like armor. When? A pause. How many? A pause. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He ended the call and looked at her, and the man who'd been sitting at her kitchen table for 2 hours was already partly somewhere else. I have to go, he said. What happened? One of my warehouses on the south side, Veshi's people. He was already moving toward his coat. Russo will be here within the hour. You and your grandmother don't leave the building tonight. Matteo. He stopped at the door. How bad, she said. The pause he gave her before answering was exactly long enough to tell her that he was deciding how much to say, and that whatever he decided, it wasn't going to be everything. 2 men are dead, he said. Mine. Then he was gone, and the kitchen felt considerably larger in his absence, and Lucia sat at the table and looked at the place where his coffee cup had been, and thought about warehouse fires and dead men, and a photograph that had arrived in the mail with 8 words written on the back of it, and the specific nauseating arithmetic of being the variable in someone else's equation. Sophia came in from the bedroom. She stood in the doorway in her robe and looked at Lucia with the clear-eyed attention of a woman who had raised this girl from 8 years old and could read her face the way other people read clocks. Mija, she said, I'm fine. You're not fine. Sophia crossed to the table and sat down and put her hand over Lucia's. Tell me. I got us into something, Lucia said. I got us into something bad. You got yourself out of something bad, Sophia said. That's not the same. Lucia looked at her. There are people watching this building, Abuela. There's a man who wants to hurt me because of who Matteo is, and I'm in the middle of something I don't. I can't see the edges of this. I can't tell where it ends. Sophia was quiet for a moment, her hand still over Lucia's. This man, she said. Matteo. She pronounced it in the Spanish way, soft T, like she'd been saying it for years. He looks at you like you're something he doesn't know what to do with. That's not... Men like that, Sophia said, don't look at women like you like that unless something has already happened inside them, something they can't take back. Lucia said nothing. The question, Sophia said, is not whether this is complicated. The question is whether you trust him. I don't know him well enough to trust him. You knew Derek for 3 years, Sophia said simply. The sentence landed like a flat stone. Lucia looked at her grandmother. I'm not saying it's the same, Sophia said. I'm saying you've been measuring this man against your fear instead of against your own judgment. Your judgment has always been good, Mija. Better than you give it credit for. Fear borrowed it for a while. She squeezed her hand once. But I think you're starting to want it back. She got up, put the kettle on, moved around the kitchen with the comfortable certainty of a woman who had decided that wherever she was going to be useful in it. Lucia sat at the table. She was still sitting there an hour later when Russo arrived with 2 additional men and a face that said the situation at the Southside warehouse had been worse than 20 minutes of information had conveyed. And she looked at him and said, before he could manage his delivery or soften the edges, tell me everything. Russo looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down. Veshi sent a message tonight, he said. Not just the warehouse. While we were dealing with the warehouse, he stopped, put a photograph on the table. This was hand-delivered to the building where you used to work. To the building manager, with a note that said it was for Matteo. The photograph showed the exterior of the Evanston building. This building. Taken tonight, in the last 2 hours. And in the lower left corner of the frame, barely visible through the second-floor window, the warm yellow light of the kitchen light. Lucia stared at the photograph, and her brain did the thing it sometimes did under pressure, and split into 2 tracks, one processing the immediate reality of what she was looking at, and one running slightly behind it, still catching up, still trying to reconcile the fact of the image with what it meant that the image existed. The window, the light, the exact angle. Someone had been standing on the street below within the last 2 hours, looking up at this window, and had taken this photograph and had gotten it to Veshi fast enough for Veshi to send it to the building where she used to work as a message to a man who was currently at a burning warehouse on the south side. The logistics of that required resources. The kind of resources that said Vesci had not been preparing for this moment since Lucia moved to the brownstone, or since the parking structure photograph, or even since Matteo had first registered her existence. The kind of resources that said someone had been building this architecture for considerably longer. How did he know about this building? She asked. Russo was looking at his phone. Working on that? That's not an answer. No. He looked up. It's not. She looked at him steadily. Russo was not a man who was comfortable being looked at steadily by women who cleaned penthouses for a living. She could tell. Not out of contempt exactly, but out of a professional habit of categorizing people and placing them in the part of his mental architecture where they were least likely to complicate things. She was currently complicating things. Who knew about this location? She said. Inner circle. 4 people besides Matteo. And you. And me. 5 people. Yes. She let the silence do its work. Russo was smart enough to feel where it was going. She could see it in the small tightening around his eyes. And he was also smart enough to know that arguing with the direction it was going required either evidence or a better explanation than he currently had. His phone rang. He stepped into the hallway to answer it. Lucia sat with the photograph. The warm yellow light of the kitchen in the lower left corner of the frame, her shadow barely visible, crossing the window at the edge. She had walked past that window 20 minutes before Russo arrived. She'd been thinking about Sophia's kettle and Matteo's warehouse and the arithmetic of being a variable, and outside in the cold someone had been watching the window with a telephoto lens, and none of the 2 men posted at the building's entrance had seen them, which meant they'd been positioned before the men were posted. Or they knew where the men were posted. Or both. Russo came back in. His face had changed. That was Matteo, he said. How bad is the warehouse? Warehouse is handled. A pause that had weight in it. He's on his way back. He wants you and your grandmother ready to move within the hour. Move where? He'll tell you when he gets here. She looked at him. What happened, Russo? He sat down heavily. He was a man who did not sit down heavily. She'd noticed that about him in the 3 days she'd been aware of his existence, the way he moved with the contained physicality of someone who had learned that economy of motion was its own form of readiness. Sitting down heavily was out of character, and that made it more alarming than any specific piece of information would have been. One of the 4 people who knew about this location, he said. He stopped. Started again. We have a problem that is larger than a photograph. Matteo arrived in 38 minutes. He came in fast, and he came in alone except for the young one with the scar through his eyebrow. Lucia had learned his name was Ren, that was all, just Ren. And he looked at Russo first, and then at Lucia, and then at the photograph on the table, and his face did the full compression thing, everything going inward, and she watched him take 3 seconds to complete a thought he didn't share. Where's Sophia? He asked. Bedroom. She's asleep. Good. Let her sleep. He sat down, not across from her, beside her, which changed the geometry of the conversation in a way she noticed, putting them on the same side of the table facing the room rather than facing each other. Tell me what Russo told you, he said. He told me almost nothing and then told me you'd explain. Okay? He put his hands flat on the table. She'd noticed he did that sometimes. The gesture of a man who needed to establish contact with something solid before delivering information he didn't want to deliver. The warehouse tonight was a distraction. Vesci hit it knowing we'd have to respond, knowing it would pull me and most of my available people to the south side for at minimum an hour. While someone photographed this building. From a location that was already pre-selected. He looked at the photograph. The angle is from the building directly across the street. 3rd floor east-facing unit, which has been vacant for 2 months. Vesci had someone positioned there in advance. Yes. A pause. Which means someone told him this was the location before we moved you here, before the decision was made. He looked at her. I made the decision about Evanston 4 hours before we moved you. The people who knew were Russo, Ren, a man named Carver, and a woman named Delia who manages my secondary properties. You're saying one of those 4 people told Vesci where you were taking me. I'm saying that's the only architecture that works. The word architecture landed oddly in Lucia's head, because she'd used the same word to herself 20 minutes ago, and it was the right word for what this was. Not a leak, not a slip, but something deliberately constructed, planned, load-bearing. "You've been looking for a mole," she said. Matteo was quiet for a moment. "For about 3 months." "You didn't find them in 3 months." "No." "But now you know it's one of 4 people." "Yes." She looked at him. "You could narrow it further. Which of those 4 people knew about the warehouse?" Russo, who had been standing near the doorway, made a small sound. She glanced at him, and he was looking at her with the expression of someone recalibrating a categorization. "All 4 knew about the warehouse," Matteo said. "But Russo and Wren were with me when I made the call about Evanston. Carver was briefed after. Delia was briefed separately by phone." He paused. "Russo and Wren also knew the warehouse location, which means it could still be any of them." "Yes." She sat with that. Around the table, Russo and Wren were both present, both aware of exactly what was being said in front of them, both presumably aware that they were 2 of the 4 people on the list, and the quality of silence in the room had the particular density of people who were being very careful about how they breathed. "I need to make some calls," Matteo said. He looked at Russo. "Get Carver here." Russo nodded and stepped out. Wren stayed. He was leaning against the wall near the hallway, arms crossed, and he was young enough that the effort of keeping his face neutral was visible in the small tensions around his jaw and his eyes, the way you could see the mechanics of control in someone who hadn't yet learned to make it invisible. Lucia looked at him. "How long have you worked for Matteo?" she asked. Wren glanced at Matteo. Matteo said nothing. 7 years, Wren said. "Since you were what, 20? 21. She nodded slowly, filed it, said nothing else. Matteo stood and went to the window and looked out at the street, and she could see him running the arithmetic, the same kind of parallel processing she'd been doing, the way 2-track thinking worked when the stakes were high enough to demand it. She'd seen it in herself in bad situations, the split between function and feeling, and she recognized it in him now. "I need you to understand something," he said, still looking out the window. "The photograph Vesci sent tonight, the message on it. Every bruise you hide belongs to me now," she said. "He's not making a statement about you." He turned. "He's making a statement about me, about what he thinks he's found." A pause. "He thinks you're leverage. Am I wrong to think that he's right?" The question landed clean. Matteo held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "because leverage implies a transaction, that you're something I'd trade for, and that's not—" He stopped. "Not what?" "Not what this is," he said. She looked at him for a long time. "Then what is this?" she said. The question she'd been not asking for 6 days held in the space between them now, finally out in the open, where it couldn't be managed back into something smaller. Matteo came back to the table. He sat down, and he looked at her with the expression she'd been slowly learning, the one that had no performance in it, no operational layer, nothing between whatever was behind his eyes and the surface of them. "Something I don't have a good answer for," he said. "That's the honest version." She believed him. That was the part that complicated everything. Carver arrived 40 minutes later. He was mid-40s, lean in the way of someone who'd stayed lean through discipline rather than metabolism, with the particular grooming of a man who took care of his appearance because he'd learned at some point that looking right was a form of armor. He came in shaking rain off his coat and looked at the room with the practiced calm of a man who showed up to difficult meetings professionally. He looked at Lucia. She looked back. Something happened in his expression, small, quick, a minor recalibration of whatever he'd expected to find when he walked through the door. It was gone in less than a second. But she'd been cataloging rooms and the people in them for years, and she caught it. "Carver," Matteo said. "Sit down." Carver sat. Matteo put the photograph on the table in front of him. Carver looked at it. His face did a convincing version of concern. The right timing, the right amount. But conviction came from a different place than performance, and something about the pacing of his reaction was off by just enough. "When did this arrive?" Carver asked. "Tonight," Matteo said, "while we were at the warehouse. Someone surveilled the location." Yes. From where? The building across the street. Carver shook his head slowly. They had it pre-positioned. That's right. Which means they knew about Evanston before we moved her here. He looked at Mateo with something appropriately grave in his expression. Someone talked. Yes, Mateo said. Someone did. The room was quiet. Lucia was watching Carver's hands. They were flat on the table, relaxed, which was the thing that was wrong. A man hearing that there was a mole in the inner circle, actually hearing it for the first time without prior knowledge of it, did not keep their hands relaxed. The body responded before the mind could manage it. Russo's hands had tightened on his phone when the information had hit him. Ren's jaw had done its thing. Even Mateo's hands had pressed flat to the table, seeking contact with something solid. Carver's hands were already flat, already still, already managed. She looked at Mateo. He was looking at her. He'd seen it too. The moment between them was less than a second long and carried enough information to fill a much longer conversation. How much did Vesci pay you? Mateo asked. The room temperature dropped about 5 degrees in the space of that sentence. Carver's face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, which was real and involuntary. Calculation, which replaced it almost immediately. And then a settling into something that had no pretense left in it, smooth and flat, and entirely different from the performance he'd been running a moment before. More than you're worth at this point, Carver said. The gun was in his hand before anyone in the room finished processing the sentence, not pointed at Mateo, pointed at Lucia. The calculation was obvious and immediate. Mateo armed, Russo armed, Ren armed, 1 gun against 3. Those were bad odds for any one target. But Lucia was not armed, and Lucia was the variable, and a man who'd spent 3 months building an architecture of betrayal was smart enough to know which piece on the board changed the math. Nobody moved. Vesci wants her, Carver said. His voice had gone completely flat. Not dead. Wants her for the same reason Mateo wants her. She's the leverage. Except Vesci intends to use it. A pause. Walk out with me. I call it in. She's back before morning. Nobody else has to. Don't finish that sentence, Mateo said. You're outnumbered in this city, Mateo. Vesci has the Northside contracts. He has 3 of your former captains. He has you, Mateo said. He bought 1 man out of my organization, and he used you to hand him an address and a warehouse fire and a photograph. That's what 3 months of work got him. A pause. He doesn't have the Northside. He has the illusion of it. He has her, Carver said. The gun didn't waver. Right now in this room, he has her. And you're going to let me walk out with her, or I'm going to make the next several minutes very difficult for everyone. Lucia was watching the gun. More specifically, she was watching Carver's hand, the one holding the gun, and the specific quality of tension in his wrist and forearm, and thinking about something she'd read once in a self-defense pamphlet that a counselor had given her 3 years ago that she'd kept in her drawer but never acted on. That most people who pointed guns at other people in high-pressure situations were managing their own adrenaline, and adrenaline created a very specific kind of tunnel vision, a narrowing of attention to the primary target, and that the narrowing had exploitable edges. She was also thinking about the kettle, Sophia's kettle, still on the stove, still warm. She moved. Not fast. Fast would have triggered the gun. She moved the way she'd moved for 18 months, the way you moved when you were trying not to be noticed, when you needed to occupy space without drawing attention to it. She shifted her weight sideways, casually, the way a person shifted when they were uncomfortable in a chair. Carver's eyes moved to track her. Just for a fraction of a second. Ren was already across the room. The gun went off. The sound in the small kitchen was catastrophic, physically painful, filling the space completely, bouncing off the tile and the cabinets in a way that felt like it had mass. Lucia hit the floor reflexively, old muscle memory, arms around her head, making herself small. She heard Carver hit something hard, the sound of a struggle that was brief and definitively one-sided. Then silence. She became aware of her own breathing first, then the ringing in her ears, then the sensation of the kitchen floor against her palms, cold and solid. Lucia. Mateo's voice, close. She lifted her head. He was crouching beside her, one hand on her shoulder. Careful, the way he was always careful, not gripping, just present. His face had the specific quality of a man running a damage assessment, but working very hard not to let the assessment show as urgency. "Are you hit?" She checked. Arms, legs, the specific inventory of physical sensation. "No." "You sure?" "Yes." She sat up. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them like they belonged to someone else. Carver was on the floor across the room with Ren's knee on his back and his gun skidded against the baseboard. He was alive. She could see his shoulders moving with his breath. The bullet had gone into the upper cabinet above where she'd been sitting, blowing a hole through the wood that was still trailing splinters. Sophia was in the bedroom doorway. She was looking at the hole in the cabinet with the expression of a woman making a very deliberate decision about which emotions to lead with. "Mija?" she said. "Are you hurt?" "No, abuela." "Good." Sophia looked at Carver on the floor, then at Mateo, then back at Lucia. "I'll make more coffee," she said, and went back into the bedroom and closed the door. Lucia let out a sound that was almost a laugh. It came from somewhere complicated and landed somewhere complicated, and Mateo, still crouching beside her, heard it, and something shifted briefly in his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite relief, but something that was made of both. "Your grandmother," he said. "I know," Lucia said. He helped her up. The rest of the night was logistics. Russo made calls. Ren managed Carver, who had transitioned from flat-voiced professional to calculating what cooperation might buy him, which Mateo received with the patience of a man who had already decided what cooperation was and was not going to buy, and was letting Carver reach his own conclusions about it. Lucia sat on the counter because she didn't want to sit at the table with the hole in the cabinet above it, and drank coffee that was not as good as the Sophia-produced version, and listened to Mateo work. He was different in operational mode. She'd seen it at the lakefront meeting, and now she was seeing it close up. The compression became something almost useful, a kind of total concentration that narrowed to the problem at hand and excluded everything else. He spoke in short sentences. He listened more than he spoke. He made decisions with the particular economy of someone who had made enough decisions under pressure to know that the cost of indecision was usually higher than the cost of being wrong. At 3 in the morning, he came and stood in front of her. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. Carver wasn't just passing information to Vesci, he said. He was coordinating. What happened tonight, the warehouse, the photograph, the timing, that was the opening, not the main event. She felt the cold come in again. "What's the main event?" Vesci made an offer tonight. To my remaining captains. Money, guaranteed territories, full protection from federal investigation. A pause. "The federal piece is real. He has someone in the DOJ who's been building a case against me for 8 months. Carver was the source inside my organization." Another pause. "The offer has a deadline, 72 hours. If my captains take it, my organization collapses from the inside. I lose all protection. Vesci moves in. And you?" The word hung there. "Vesci doesn't want me dead," Mateo said. "Dead men become martyrs. He wants me visible, arrested, tried, convicted. He hands me to the federal case with a bow on it and takes over everything I've built while I'm in a courtroom." Lucia looked at him. "Your organization is going to collapse," she said. Not a question. A reading of his face, which had already arrived at this conclusion some time ago and was delivering it to her now, with the careful neutrality of someone who had made peace with a fact before stating it. "Probably, yes. And you need to decide what to do in 72 hours. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "What are your options?" she said. He looked at her. The question clearly wasn't what he'd been expecting, or wasn't what he'd been expecting from her specifically, and she saw him adjust again. That minor recalibration that she was beginning to recognize as his response to her not being what he'd anticipated. "Fight," he said, "which means a war that costs a lot of lives and probably ends the same way." He paused. "Or make a different kind of deal." "With who?" He was quiet. "Moretti." She held his eyes. "With who?" "The federal case," he said slowly. "The same one Vesci's been building. It's been built partly on Carver's information, which means the foundation is compromised. But the prosecutor would still want what I know, which is considerably more than what Carver could give them. Another pause. Cooperation has a price, testimony, naming names, dismantling the organization from the inside, but on my terms, not Veshi's. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside 4 a.m, Chicago. The specific silence of a city between its last night sounds and its first morning ones, a window of about 40 minutes where the streets actually went quiet. "You'd be ending your own organization," she said. "Yes. To keep Veshi from taking it. And to keep myself out of a federal prison. And to—" He stopped, looked at her. "And because I'm sitting in a kitchen in Evanston at 3 a.m. and there's a hole in the cabinet and your hands were shaking and I'm tired." He said it flatly, without performance. The specific exhaustion of a man who has just said a true thing and knows it. "I'm very tired of this being what my life is." She didn't say anything for a long time. She thought about the university application. Half-filled, unsubmitted, sitting in her phone like a letter she'd written to a version of herself she wasn't sure she was allowed to be yet. She thought about what Carver's gun had sounded like in a small kitchen. She thought about Mateo's hands pressing flat on the table before he delivered information he didn't want to deliver, and the photograph of his mother worn at the corners, and the way he'd said "I would rather die in the warehouse" in the outline she hadn't witnessed yet, but somehow already knew was coming. Not because she'd been told it, but because she'd learned enough about the shape of this man to know where certain roads in him led. "If you cooperate," she said. "What happens to you?" "Reduced exposure, new name probably, life significantly smaller than this one." "And Veshi?" "Goes down with the rest of it. He's in the same federal case. Carver was feeding them Veshi's operations alongside mine. The prosecutor wants both of us. Cooperation means I'm the one who walks." She looked at him. "Then do it," she said. He was quiet. "Mateo." She looked at him steadily. "Do it." "You understand what I'm saying I am," he said. "What this means, I've been." "Yes." "And I'm telling you to take the exit," she said, "before it closes." Something happened in his face. She watched it happen slowly this time, not the quick involuntary flash of earlier nights. Something that took longer, that moved through several layers before it arrived at the surface. And what it arrived at was not an expression she had a clean name for. It was the face of a man looking at something he had not expected to be offered, and was not entirely sure he was allowed to take. His phone rang. They both looked at it on the table, Russo's name on the screen. Mateo picked it up. She watched his face change, watched the operational layer slam back into place, faster than she'd ever seen it happen. "Say that again," he said. A pause. 5 seconds. She counted them. "How long ago?" Another pause. He lowered the phone. Lucia looked at him. The man who had just been talking about exits and exhaustion and new names was gone. Something older and colder had replaced him, something that looked like Matteo Moretti but occupied the space differently, more completely, with less of the room for anything else. "She went out," he said. Lucia's body processed the sentence before her mind did. Something in her chest went very still. "Sophia," he said, "your grandmother. She went out 30 minutes ago. She told the man on the door she needed air. A pause that had something working inside it, something that Matteo was keeping contained through visible effort. He let her go, 1 block. She was supposed to be 1 block. Lucia was already off the counter. "Where is she?" she said. Not loud. Very level. The voice of someone for whom volume was not available right now because all available resources were being directed elsewhere. "Veshi's people had someone on the street," Matteo said. He said it steadily, and she understood that the steadiness was the most he could do for her right now, that it was a gift of a kind, that he was holding himself very still so that she could respond to the information without the additional weight of his reaction. "They have her." The kitchen walls were very close. "He called," Matteo said. "Veshi called. He says he wants a meeting, in person, tomorrow night." A pause. "He says if I don't come, I'm coming with you," Lucia said. "No. She's my grandmother," Lucia said. Her voice had gone somewhere she didn't entirely recognize, somewhere below the register she used for normal things, below even the register she used for bad things, somewhere that had no shaking in it, no adjustment, nothing managed or careful or measured. I'm coming with you. Don't argue with me. Matteo looked at her for a long moment. What he was looking at, she knew. Not a woman who needed protection, not a variable in someone else's equation, not the person he'd found bleeding in a kitchen 8 days ago who'd flinched at the sound of a raised voice. He was looking at something that had taken 8 days of safety and a gunshot in a kitchen and her grandmother's name to fully arrive at the surface. Whatever it was, he recognized it. All right, he said quietly. Outside in the 4 a.m. silence of the city, a phone was ringing in a warehouse on the south side where a man named Salvatore Vesci sat in a folding chair and watched an old woman with bad hips sit very straight in a metal chair across from him and refuse, with magnificent stubbornness, to look. The drive to the south side took 22 minutes and Lucia counted them. Not consciously. Her brain had gone into the same split-track mode it used during bad situations. One part managing the immediate present, one part running slightly behind it, cataloging. 22 minutes of city moving past rain-dark windows. 22 minutes of Matteo beside her in the back seat making calls in a low voice that she could hear but couldn't follow. The shorthand of men who had worked together long enough to have their own compression, their own language of half-sentences that meant whole things. Russo drove. Ren sat in the passenger seat with the weapon she didn't look at directly because looking at it directly required processing what it meant that she was in a car going toward the place where Sophia was, and she needed to keep the processing narrow right now. Wide processing was a luxury. She couldn't afford it yet. She thought about Sophia making coffee in a kitchen that wasn't hers. Sophia finding a cast iron pan in a cabinet and declaring it superior to everything she'd owned. Sophia standing in a doorway looking at a bullet hole in a cabinet above the table where her granddaughter had been sitting 30 seconds earlier and saying, "I'll make more coffee." 71 years old with bad hips and the specific indestructible stubbornness of a woman who had already outlived 2 husbands in a neighborhood and was not prepared to be defeated by circumstances. She had better be okay. Matteo ended his last call. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight and texture to it, the kind you could feel against your skin. "How many does Vesci have at the warehouse?" she asked. "Estimate 12 to 15. And you're bringing." "Enough." She looked at him. "That's not—" "6 men plus Russo and Ren." He held her gaze. "And I need you to do something for me." "What?" "When we go in," he said, "you stay behind me. Not behind the men, behind me specifically. You do not move unless I move first. You do not engage with Vesci directly, regardless of what he says or what you see." A pause. "Sophia is fine. He needs her functional. She's leverage, not a target." "You don't know that." "I know Vesci." His voice had the particular flatness of certainty. Not reassurance, not comfort, just assessment delivered clean. "He is careful. He is patient. He has been building this for months. He does not damage his leverage before he uses it." A pause. "She's uncomfortable and probably angry, not hurt." Lucia thought about Sophia sitting very straight in a metal chair somewhere and refusing to look at the man across from her, and felt something loosen fractionally in her chest because, yes, that was exactly what Sophia would do. And the specificity of the image was more comforting than any abstraction about leverage would have been. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. Then, "When this is over, the conversation we were having before Russo called, after," she said. "After," he agreed. The warehouse was on a street that had been industrial 20 years ago, and was industrial still, the kind of block that cities forget about deliberately, where the buildings had corrugated steel sides and loading docks, and no windows at human height, and the streetlights were spaced far enough apart that the dark between them was actual dark. 2 vehicles were parked outside with their lights off. A man stood at the loading dock entrance with his hands in his pockets, who stopped having his hands in his pockets when their SUV pulled up. Russo stopped the car half a block short. Matteo looked at the man at the loading dock, looked at the 2 vehicles. "He has someone on the roof," Ren said from the front seat. He had a scope to his eye. left side, and the east corner. How visible are they? Visible enough. A pause. He wants us to know they're there. He's managing the approach, Matteo said. Not to anyone specifically, just processing out loud, which she'd noticed he did sometimes, not thinking aloud exactly, more like letting the final layer of a thought surface before acting on it. He could have hidden them. He didn't. He wants us walking in knowing we're covered. Why? Lucia said. Because he wants this to feel like a negotiation. He looked at her. It's not a negotiation. He got out of the car. Lucia got out. Russo started to say something, and she looked at him with the expression she'd used on the second morning of their acquaintance, and he closed his mouth, which she was grateful for because she didn't have the bandwidth right now for the conversation, where she explained again that she wasn't a variable in someone else's equation. They crossed the half-block in the dark. The man at the loading dock watched them come. He was large, mid-30s, with the particular quality of stillness that came from professional training rather than natural temperament. The stillness of someone who had learned that economy of movement read as confidence, as control. He looked at Lucia. She wasn't invited, he said. I invited myself, Lucia said. The man looked at Matteo. Matteo said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The man stepped aside. Inside, the warehouse smelled like metal and old oil, and the specific cold of a space that was never quite heated, just kept above the temperature where breath was visible. The floor was concrete, stained dark in patterns that Lucia's brain tried to interpret, and she redirected firmly away from interpreting. High ceiling, steel rafters. Banks of fluorescent lights, maybe a third of them functional, throwing pools of cold white light that left the spaces between them genuinely dim. Sophia was at the far end. Metal chair, just as Lucia had imagined it. Sitting absolutely straight with her hands folded in her lap and her chin level, wearing her robe over her clothes because she'd clearly been taken before she'd fully dressed, and the specific expression on her face was one Lucia had seen directed at bad doctors, at dismissive landlords, at men who underestimated women past a certain age, a look of such comprehensive unimpressedness that it functioned almost as an aesthetic statement. Their eyes met across the warehouse floor. Sophia gave a small, precise nod. I'm fine. I know you came. Don't do anything foolish. Lucia gave a fractional nod back. I know you're fine. I'm here. We're leaving. Salvatore Vesci was standing 10 feet from Sophia's chair. He was not what she'd been expecting, though she hadn't examined what she'd been expecting closely enough to have a clear image. He was 60, perhaps. Slim, silver-haired, in a dark suit that fit well enough to have been made specifically for him. He had the face of a man who spent considerable time presenting himself as reasonable, as measured, as the kind of person whose violence was always the regrettable consequence of someone else's poor decision-making. He looked like a man who gave eulogies at expensive funerals and meant none of them. He was smiling. Matteo, he said. The warmth in it was perfectly calibrated. The exact temperature of the greeting between two men who had known each other long enough to have arrived at mutual respect for each other's dangerousness. You look tired. Where's the man you had on our door, Matteo said. Not the greeting, not the performance. Straight to it. Vesci's smile didn't change. He's fine, a little embarrassed. He looked at Lucia with the specific quality of attention that she recognized instantly, the assessing look, the one that measured and calculated and placed. She'd been the recipient of that look from men her entire life, and she'd learned to hold very still under it, to give it nothing. This must be the woman everyone's talking about. You wanted a meeting, Matteo said. We're here. We are. Vesci clasped his hands behind his back and moved in a slow half-circle, which was a performance for the 6 men she could see positioned around the warehouse perimeter and however many she couldn't see. A man demonstrating comfort in his own space. I want to be clear about something. I have nothing against you personally, Miss Velez, Lucia said. Miss Velez. You've been made a piece of something you didn't choose, and for that I apologize. He did not sound like he was apologizing. He sounded like a man saying the word apologize while meaning something else entirely. My issue is with Matteo. specifically with the fact that he's been occupying territory and infrastructure that the current landscape no longer supports him occupying. You want his organization, Lucia said. Vesey looked at her with something that was almost genuine, a flicker of actual engagement beneath the performance. I want stability, he said, the same thing every reasonable person wants. Mateo's organization has become a liability to the stability of this city's. You burned a warehouse and kidnapped a 71-year-old woman, Lucia said. Don't talk to me about stability. Vesey looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Mateo. I like her, he said. I understand the attachment. What do you want? Mateo said. What I've always wanted. Vesey moved to a folding table against the wall and picked up a folder and held it out toward Mateo. The North Side contracts transfer to my organization. The South Side distribution network, all of it, including the 3 warehouses you think I don't know about, transfers within 30 days. You take what's in this envelope? He produced an envelope from inside his jacket. And you and Miss Velez and her grandmother go wherever people go when they're done. He paused. It's enough money to be somewhere comfortable for a long time. Mateo didn't move toward the folder. And the federal case, he said. Vesey's smile was patient. That resolves itself. Through your DOJ contact, through various channels, which also go away once you have what you want. Mateo, you take everything, Mateo said. The flatness in his voice had gone somewhere colder. You take the organization, you take the infrastructure, you eliminate the federal exposure, and I take money and disappear. And your DOJ contact stays in place, and you own the legal threat indefinitely, which means the deal you're offering tonight can be revisited whenever it suits you. Vesey was quiet for a moment. You've thought this through, he said. I had 22 minutes in a car. Then you know there's no better option on the table. There's one, Mateo said. Vesey looked at him. I made a call tonight, Mateo said. Before we came here, the federal prosecutor, not your contact, the lead prosecutor, received a file. Documentation of your DOJ contacts arrangement with your organization going back 4 years. He paused. Your contact is being taken into custody approximately right now. The file also includes everything Carver gave you about my organization, along with everything I know about yours, which is considerably more complete than what Carver had access to. The warehouse went very quiet. Lucia watched Vesey's face. The reasonable, measured, we're all adults here quality drained out of it gradually, replaced not with rage, not yet, but with something more dangerous, which was the expression of a man recalculating in real time and arriving at an answer he didn't like. You cooperated, Vesey said. Yes. You gave them your own organization. What's left of it after your 3 months of work, yes. To get immunity. To get something, Mateo said, which is more than this deal offers. The silence that followed had a specific quality, the silence of a room full of armed men waiting for a signal from the man at the center of it, a room in which every variable was now in motion simultaneously, and the outcome was genuinely unresolved in a way it hadn't been 60 seconds ago. Vesey's smile came back, thinner this time. No warmth in the calibration now. The file doesn't matter, he said, even if what you're saying is true. And I'm not certain it is. The timeline for that kind of action is days, not hours. Tonight I still have 12 men in this building, and you have 8 and an old woman and a girl who cleans apartments. He looked at Lucia when he said it, direct, deliberate, watching for the flinch. She didn't give it to him. And I have something else, Vesey said. He nodded to someone behind Lucia. She heard the footsteps and turned, and there were 2 men she hadn't accounted for, coming from a section of the warehouse she hadn't been able to see from the entrance, and between them was a 3rd man who looked like he'd had a difficult 12 hours. Bloody nose, torn jacket, the specific posture of someone whose hands were zip-tied behind their back. Russo made a sound beside her. The man between Vesey's people was one of Mateo's captains. She didn't know his name. She knew his face from a photograph Russo had shown her during the 2nd day in the brownstone, a quick briefing on the inner structure of what she'd gotten herself into. Senior. Northside Operations. One of the men Vesey had been making offers to. Marco came to me 2 days ago, Vesci said, before tonight's festivities. He brought some useful information and expressed an interest in the transition. A pause. He also brought something I found very interesting, something about the cooperation you just described. Matteo was very still. Your immunity agreement, Vesci said, it's conditional, not final, which means if the cooperation falls apart, if, for instance, key witnesses became unavailable or key documentation developed problems, he spread his hands. The case goes back to what it was before you made your call, which is a federal prosecution of Matteo Moretti built on Carver's testimony and 3 years of surveillance with a very motivated prosecutor. Lucia felt the structure of it settle into place. Vesci didn't need to destroy the cooperation. He just needed to create enough interference that the immunity agreement didn't finalize. And Marco, standing there with zip-tied wrists in what was clearly a performance of captivity designed to establish deniability, had just told him exactly how much time he had to do it. You can't get to the prosecutor, Matteo said. I don't need to get to the prosecutor. I need to get to one witness, one piece of documentation, one thread in the file. Vesci looked at him steadily. You have 72 hours before that agreement finalizes. I have 12 men in this building and resources you are no longer in a position to match. He picked up the envelope from the table. Take the deal, Matteo. Take it, walk out with your woman and her grandmother, and in 72 hours, none of this matters to either of us. The warehouse held its breath. Lucia looked at Matteo. His face was doing nothing she could read. Completely still, completely compressed, and she'd been learning his face for 8 days, and this was a version of it she hadn't encountered. Not the operational layer, not the thing beneath it. Something below both of those, something that lived at the foundation. He looked at Sophia. Sophia looked back at him with the clear-eyed attention of a woman who had made a decision about this man some time ago and was not revising it under present circumstances. He looked at Lucia. She looked at him and thought about the word after. The word he'd used in the car when she'd cut off the conversation they'd been having. After. The implicit promise of it, that there was an after to get to, that the conversation existed in a future that was being held in reserve. She gave him the smallest possible nod. He turned back to Vesci. No, he said. Vesci studied him for a moment. No, he repeated. The deal you're offering has an expiration date, Matteo said. It expires whenever it becomes convenient for you, so no. Vesci was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, Bring her. 2 of his men moved toward Lucia. Matteo moved first. The first man went down before he'd closed half the distance between them. Matteo's elbow connecting with the side of his jaw with the specific economy of someone for whom this was not a new language, but a native one. The second man adjusted, and Russo was already there, and the warehouse detonated into motion. 6 positions around the perimeter, activating simultaneously, Ren moving toward the left side with a speed that was startling in a person that lean, shouting from 2 different directions, the particular percussion of bodies hitting concrete and metal, and each other in a space with good acoustics for it. Lucia moved toward Sophia. Not fast enough. One of Vesci's men was already between her and Sophia's chair, and he was large and had enough of a distance advantage that she stopped 3 feet from him, and they looked at each other for a moment across the specific kind of standoff that had no good options inside it. Sophia stood up from the metal chair. She did it slowly, with the dignity of a woman whose hips hurt, and who was choosing not to let that be visible. And she looked at the man between her and Lucia with the comprehensive unimpressedness she'd been deploying since she arrived in this building. And she said in Spanish something that Lucia had heard her say to bad doctors and dismissive landlords and men who underestimated women past a certain age. The man blinked. It was half a second. Less. Lucia went through the half second like it was a door. She hit him low because low was where you went when you were 5'4", and the alternative was going high against someone who outweighed you by 80 pounds, driving her shoulder into his solar plexus the way the self-defense pamphlet had said, and the way she'd never done in actual practice, but her body apparently remembered the geometry of it. They both went down. The impact with the concrete was something she felt in her teeth. The man's elbow connected with her cheekbone on the way, and she saw white for a moment, brilliant, total, then receding back to the dim fluorescent reality of a warehouse floor. She got up. Sophia was already moving toward her, slower, and caught her arm. Mija, I'm okay. Her cheekbone was fire. She could feel it swelling already, the rapid, specific heat of tissue responding to impact. Are you? I'm fine. Sophia gripped her arm with the strength of a woman who had been furious for the past hour and had not yet found an adequate outlet for it. I'm very angry, and I'm fine. Good. Same. She looked around the warehouse. The fight had the quality of things that were still in motion. Not chaos exactly, more like a very complicated calculation being worked out simultaneously in 3 dimensions. Men in various states of engagement across the floor, Russo visible near the east wall, Ren near the loading dock entrance dealing with 2 men with the focused efficiency of someone doing a job they were good at. Mateo was at the center of the warehouse, and Vesci was 6 feet from him with a gun, not pointed yet, held. At his side, pointed at the floor, the specific posture of a man who was keeping it in reserve, who understood that discharging it too early closed options he might still want open. Last chance, Vesci said. His suit jacket was open. There was a cut above his eyebrow from something, a corner, a door frame. She couldn't tell. The calibrated reasonableness was entirely gone. What was left was older and more specific and considerably more honest. Walk away, take the deal. Where's Marco? Mateo said. Irrelevant. He's not in this building anymore. Mateo looked around the warehouse. He wasn't actually your prisoner. He was your messenger. You needed me to know about the immunity agreement's conditions. You needed me to think you had a card you don't have. Vesci's expression shifted. Marco is not in your organization, Mateo said. He hasn't been for 2 weeks. He's in protective custody. His testimony is part of the cooperation file. A pause. There's no thread to pull. The agreement finalizes in 72 hours, regardless of what happens in this building tonight. Vesci raised the gun. Lucia moved. She didn't decide to. The decision happened somewhere below the level of thought, in the body that had learned through long practice to move before the thinking caught up, and she moved across the 6 feet between her and Mateo's left side, and the gun went off, and the gun went off, and Lucia felt the bullet before she heard the second shot. Not pain, not immediately. The force first. The specific physics of impact, something hitting the left side of her body with enough velocity that it moved her sideways, changed her trajectory, and her brain registered it as heat before it registered it as anything else. Heat in her shoulder, spreading fast, and then she was on the concrete, and she wasn't sure when that had happened. She heard Mateo say her name. Not loud. Very quiet. The specific quiet of someone who has arrived at a moment they were not prepared for and is operating below the level where volume is a variable. She heard it cut through the warehouse noise the way certain frequencies cut through other frequencies. Not louder, just cleaner, more direct. She tried to say, I'm okay. What came out was not that. The concrete was cold against her cheek, and she was looking sideways at the warehouse floor, and she could see the soles of Mateo's shoes 3 feet away, then 2 feet away. Then he was on his knees beside her, and his hand was on her shoulder. The left one, the one that was fire, and she heard herself make a sound she didn't mean to make. Left shoulder, she managed. I think. I know. His voice was doing something she'd never heard it do before. Something compressed so far down it had come out the other side into a register that didn't have a name, didn't have any of the operational layer or the performance layer, or the thing beneath. Just the bare frequency of a man who was looking at something he could not make acceptable through any frame he had available. Vesci, she said. Russo. One word. She understood what it meant. Sophia. She's here. She's not hurt. His hand was still on her shoulder, pressing, and the pressure was pain, but it was also the right thing. She understood that, keeping something in that needed to stay in. Don't move. I'm not planning to. She heard him exhale once. Short, controlled. The breath of someone who had taken a hit that wasn't physical and was managing the aftermath of it with the only tool he had, which was the discipline of 3 decades of keeping himself operational when his body or his mind or something else was telling him to stop. She looked up at his face. It was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. All of it. The operational layer, the compression, the careful distances he maintained between what he felt and what he showed. Gone, stripped, not managed away but simply overwhelmed, the way certain volumes of water overwhelm the containers built to hold them, and there's no failure of the container, just a recognition that the container was the wrong category for this particular thing. He was afraid. Not of Vesci or the gun or the warehouse or the federal case or the 72 hours or any of the things he had navigated through the past 8 days with the specific terrible competence of someone built for exactly this kind of landscape. Afraid of losing her. She understood it when she saw it. Understood it in the clean, unambiguous way that you sometimes understood things in moments when the usual noise went away, when physical pain simplified everything down to what was actually true. "I'm not dying," she told him. His jaw tightened. "Moretti." She held his eyes. "I'm not dying, it's my shoulder." "I know what it is," he said. The flatness in it was different from his operational flatness. This was the flatness of someone controlling something through effort alone. "Then stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I'm already gone." He looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his face shifted. Not back to the operational layer, not to any of the familiar compressions. Something new. Something that had been built by the specific 8 days they had just lived through and didn't exist before them. "You moved," he said. "Yes." "I saw you move. Before the gun. Yes. You didn't have to." "I know," she said. "I did it anyway." The warehouse around them was resolving back into its component sounds. She could hear Russo's voice near the east wall, low and directing. She could hear Ren somewhere near the loading dock. She could hear what she thought was Sophia's voice, not the words, just the cadence, the particular cadence of a woman efficiently managing a situation she had not created and was not pleased about. 2 of Vesci's men were on the floor. She could see that much from her angle on the concrete. She couldn't see Vesci. "Russo," Matteo said, without looking away from her. Russo materialized from somewhere to her left. He looked at her shoulder, looked at Matteo, and his face did the quick professional triage of a man who had seen this category of damage before. "Through and through," he said quietly. "It's not—" "I know what it is," Matteo said for the second time in the exact same register, and Russo stopped talking. They got her sitting up. The movement produced a whiteout moment that she breathed through, jaw clenched, waiting for her vision to clear. When it did, Sophia was there, on her knees on the concrete floor, which had to be costing her hips considerably, with her hands on Lucia's face and her eyes running the same rapid inventory that Russo's had. "Abuela, calate." "Shut up," said with love, but said firmly. Sophia's hands moved from her face to her shoulder, efficient, pressing down over where Matteo had been pressing. "I've dressed worse than this." She looked at Matteo over Lucia's head. "Car. Now. There's a doctor?" "Yes." "Then go." He went. The next hour had the quality of things experienced at one remove. Not shock exactly, more like the body's sensible decision to manage the intensity of information coming in by applying a slight processing delay. She was aware of being moved, of the car, of Matteo's voice making calls in the same low-compressed shorthand as the drive there, but different now. The syntax altered in some way she couldn't fully identify. She was aware of a building that wasn't the Evanston building, and a room with better light and a man with clean hands, who spoke in the specific calm of someone for whom medical emergencies were the baseline rather than the exception. She was aware of Matteo sitting in a chair 4 feet from the door of the room, not pacing, just sitting with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped, staring at the middle distance with an expression she had never seen on his face, and which she catalogued carefully because she understood she was seeing something that almost nobody saw. Salvatore Vesci had not been among the men on the warehouse floor. She understood that before she asked, because she understood by now how information moved through this world and what its absence meant, and the absence of Vesci's name in anything Russo or Ren said in the car told her that the resolution had not been clean. She asked Matteo directly, 2 days later, when the shoulder had been attended to and the specific landscape of recovery had made itself known, not the dramatic pain of the initial injury, but the grinding, ongoing work of a body repairing itself, the 2 in the morning ache, the specific limitation of a left arm that couldn't be raised past a certain point without producing a sensation that reorganized her thinking entirely. "He got out," Matteo said. He was sitting in the same chair he'd occupied outside the doctor's room, or one exactly like it. She'd noticed he had a default posture for difficult conversations, slightly forward, elbows on knees, hands loosely clasped. Back exit. 2 of his men covered it. By the time Ren reached the east side, he stopped. He was gone. Where? We don't know yet. She sat with that. The federal case? She said. Filed. He looked at her. The immunity agreement finalized yesterday morning. Everything in the file. Veshi's organization, his DOJ contact, the 3 captains, the Northside contracts. It's all in the system now. His DOJ contact is in custody. His legal protection is gone. A pause. Veshi is running. He's good at running, but the landscape he's running through is considerably smaller than it was a week ago. He's still out there. Yes. And you're no longer the man he was running a war against, Matteo said. I cooperated with the prosecution of his organization along with mine. I'm not his enemy anymore. I'm his liability. He held her gaze. His incentive now is distance, not retaliation. Going after me or you brings attention he can't afford. She looked at him. You believe that? I believe it's the most likely outcome. A pause. I also believe we're not staying in Chicago. The sentence landed quietly and settled. The cooperation agreement, he said. It has conditions. New identity, relocation, significant distance from the infrastructure of the previous life. He looked at his hands. My organization is gone. The men who stayed loyal are being processed through the same system. Reduced exposure in exchange for cooperation. The men who went to Veshi are part of the prosecution. He paused. It's over. What I built for 20 years is over. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, a different building, different street, she'd stopped tracking their locations with any precision because there had been 3 moves in 5 days and she was tired. The city made its city sounds. Indifferent. Continuous. The city that had swallowed Lucia whole for 24 years, continuing to metabolize itself, regardless of what happened in its margins. Are you okay? She asked. He looked up from his hands. The question had surprised him. She could see that. I'm asking seriously, she said. Not about logistics. You. Are you okay? He was quiet for a long moment. I don't know yet, he said, which was the most honest thing he could have said, and they both knew it. She nodded. Sophia's hip, he said. The concrete at the warehouse. She needs to see a specialist. I know. I know someone in Portland. Good one. Not connected to anything. Portland, she said. Or Seattle. Or a coastal town in Oregon. Somewhere with... He stopped. Somewhere that doesn't look like this. She looked at him. Somewhere that doesn't look like Chicago. Doesn't look like corrugated steel warehouses and photographs with 8 words written on the back of them. Doesn't look like penthouses she cleaned twice a week. And apartments with bad acoustics. And the 3rd step that creaked on the left side. My university application, she said. I know. I never submitted it. I know. He held her gaze. There are schools on the West Coast. She looked at him for a long time. This is you asking me something, she said. Yes. You're very bad at asking things directly. The corner of his mouth shifted, the ghost of the thing that was almost a smile but wasn't quite. I'm asking directly, he said. I'm asking you to come with me. You and Sophia. Somewhere else. A pause. I'm not asking because you're leverage or because you're in danger or because I feel responsible for... He stopped again. I'm asking because 8 days ago I walked into your apartment and you looked at me like I was the same threat as the man who'd been hurting you, and I spent 8 days trying to be something different, and I don't... He looked at his hands. I don't want to go somewhere else and have that be the last version of this. The room was very quiet. That's the most words you've said at once, she said. He looked up. Since I've known you, she said. Something moved in his face. She watched it move. Yes, he said. She thought about the university application. Half-filled, unsubmitted, sitting in her phone like a letter to a version of herself she hadn't been sure she was allowed to be. She thought about social work and domestic abuse advocacy and the specific words she'd used in the kitchen in Evanston when she'd said them out loud for the first time. Social work, specifically domestic abuse advocacy, and the way saying them had made them real. She thought about the man who had knelt on the floor of her apartment and cleaned broken glass without being asked, who had sat outside her bedroom door, who had said you survived hell, stop apologizing for breathing in a voice that had no performance in it, who had just taken 20 years of his life and handed it to a federal prosecutor because she was in a chair in a kitchen in Evanston and he was tired of this being what his life was. You'd have to actually learn to cook, she said. He blinked. If you're going to be in a kitchen, she said. You burned the garlic. Sophia mentioned it. Sophia mentioned it to you. Sophia mentions everything to me. His face did the thing. The full thing this time. Not the ghost, not the almost smile. Something that went all the way through, that had nothing managed about it. That was the face of a man experiencing something he hadn't felt in long enough, that the feeling had the quality of a door opening in a room that had been sealed. It lasted about 3 seconds before the containment came back up. But she had seen it, and she filed it carefully in the place where she kept the things that were true. I'll learn, he said. Okay, she said. They left Chicago on a Thursday morning, 11 days after it had all started, in a car that was not registered to either of them, heading west on 90, while the city receded in the rear window into a skyline, and then a suggestion, and then the specific absence of a skyline, which was how you knew you'd actually left. Sophia slept for the first 4 hours with magnificent efficiency, reclined in the passenger seat with her hands folded and her expression peaceful, as though she had made a decision about this journey, and the decision was that it was fine, and she was therefore going to rest. Lucia sat in the back with her shoulder in a sling and watched the geography change. Illinois flattening out into the particular wide sky of the Midwest, then Iowa, then Nebraska. The landscape doing that thing it did in the middle of the country where it stopped performing and just became itself. Enormous and indifferent and oddly settling. Matteo drove. He drove the way he did most things, economically, without waste, with the full attention of someone who understood that attention was the resource you couldn't manufacture after the fact. He didn't try to fill the silence, didn't make it into something it wasn't. Just drove west while the sky got bigger and the traffic got thinner, and somewhere around the Nebraska border the specific quality of the light began to change. She fell asleep somewhere in Wyoming. When she woke, the mountains had arrived. Not gradually, but suddenly the way they always did when you came at them from the plains. The abruptness of them. The sheer vertical fact of them after so many hours of horizontal, and the last of the late afternoon light was doing things to the peaks that she couldn't look at for very long because they were the kind of beautiful that was almost uncomfortable. Matteo was still driving. She watched his profile in the fading light, the lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw that she'd been learning for 11 days. His hands at 10 and 2. She'd noticed that about him, the specific placement, always exactly there, the small discipline of a man who had learned to find the right position for things and stay in it. Wyoming, she said. For another hour. She looked at the mountains. My mother used to say, she said, and then stopped. Started again. She used to say that the only things worth having were the things you'd earned the right to keep. Not bought, not inherited, earned. She paused. I never knew what she meant exactly. She left when I was 8. I figured she was talking about herself, about leaving. Matteo said nothing, listened. I think she meant something else, Lucia said. I think she meant that the things you go through, the actual hard things, they make you into someone who can hold something without dropping it, without running from it when it gets heavy. The mountains moved slowly past the window. I'm not going to run, she said. Not to the mountains, to him. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. 3 months later, the town of Crestline, Oregon, had approximately 4,000 people in it and a coastline that on clear days produced the specific quality of light that made you understand why people had been willing to cross impossible distances to get to this edge of the continent. It had a coffee shop and a hardware store and a community college with a social sciences department, and it had a 2-story house on the north end of town with a garden that was brown in winter but showed the first suggestion of green in February. Mateo ran a small security consulting firm under the name Marcus Reyes, which was his mother's surname and which he had used for the first time on a federal form and which felt, he told Lucia one morning over bad coffee, like wearing someone else's clothes that fit better than expected. She laughed at that. He stopped what he was doing when she laughed. He always stopped what he was doing when she laughed. She'd noticed it early and it had embarrassed her at first, the weight of being noticed that specifically. And then it had stopped embarrassing her and become something else. Something she didn't have a word for yet, but which lived in the category of things she was learning to hold without dropping. Sophia's hip was better. The specialist in Portland had been exactly what Mateo had said. Good, not connected to anything, possessed of the specific quality of competence that expressed itself as matter-of-fact rather than impressive. Sophia had declared him adequate and done her physical therapy with the same comprehensive stubbornness she brought to everything. And by February, she was walking the garden in the mornings and planning what she was going to plant in spring with the absolute certainty of a woman who had decided spring was going to happen, and that was the end of that conversation. The university application had been submitted in January. Not the old one, a new one, to the community college 20 minutes up the coast, because the community college had a transfer agreement with a state university, and the state university had a social work program, and the social work program had a domestic violence advocacy track. Smaller than she'd imagined in some ways, more possible in others. She was waiting on the acceptance letter. On a Tuesday evening in late February, she stood at the kitchen window with tea going cold in her hand and watched the garden and thought about nothing in particular. Just stood there, which was its own kind of achievement, the specific luxury of a mind that could be still without bracing for something. She heard Mateo come in. The sound of his keys. His coat going on the hook. She'd taught him about the hook. There had been a whole separate negotiation about the hook. And then his footsteps in the hallway. He came and stood beside her at the window. They looked at the garden together. Sophia found a cast iron pan at the hardware store, he said. I know. She texted me 4 photographs of it. She says the one we have is inferior. The one we have is the one she brought from Evanston. She says it's been compromised by the move. Lucia looked at him sideways. She just wants a new pan, obviously. He looked at the garden. Should I get her one? If you want to be her favorite person for approximately 6 weeks, that's a good return. It really is. Outside, the February light was doing the thing it did in the late afternoon here, going gold and long against the garden beds that Sophia had already staked out with small markers for what was going where in spring. The ocean was not visible from this window, but it was present. The quality of the air, the particular way sound moved, the faint salt in everything. Mateo turned toward her. She looked at him. His face was the face she'd been learning for 4 months. Not fully legible, probably never going to be fully legible, but considerably more known than it had been. She knew the expression he made when something was bothering him that he wasn't ready to say. She knew the expression he made when Sophia said something that landed differently than he expected. She knew what he looked like at 2 a.m. when the nightmares that lived below the operational layer surfaced. She'd seen it twice, had come into the kitchen to find him there, with his hands on the counter, not shaking, just present, just waiting for the residue of it to pass. She knew what he looked like now, looking at her, with the February light going gold through the window. The letter might come tomorrow, she said. It might. If it doesn't, it will. She looked at him. You don't know that. I know you. He held her gaze. It'll come. She thought about saying something practical, something measured, something that acknowledged the reasonable uncertainty of the situation and didn't put too much weight on any one outcome. She thought about what Sophia had said in a kitchen in Evanston on a night that felt at once very recent and very long ago. Your judgment has always been good, mija. Fear borrowed it for a while, but I think you're starting to want it back. She reached up with her right hand, the good shoulder, the uninjured one, and put her palm against the side of his face. He went very still. Not the operational stillness, not the compressed, everything inward stillness she'd spent 11 days in Chicago learning to read. Something else. The stillness of a man who has been handed something he has been not expecting for long enough that the receiving of it required a moment to complete. He put his hand over hers. His hand was warm. She'd noticed that about him from the beginning. The warmth of his hands, which seemed improbable, and also entirely consistent with everything she'd learned about the distance between what people looked like and what they were. "You know what I told myself," she said, "when I was on the floor in that warehouse, when I moved and the gun went off?" "Tell me." "I told myself that there was an after," she said. "You said after, in the car, that there was a conversation we were going to have after, and I thought about that. I thought, there's an after. Just get to the after." He was very still. "I'm in the after," she said. "We're in the after." "Yes," he said. His voice had gone to the register below the operational layer, below the thing beneath it, to whatever lived at the foundation. "We are." She pressed her forehead to his. Outside, the light went on doing what it did in this particular place at this particular time of year. The garden held its plans for spring. The ocean did its constant patient work against the coastline 20 minutes away. Inside the house on the north end of a town that had approximately 4,000 people in it, a woman who had learned to make herself invisible stood with her eyes closed in a kitchen that was hers, and a man who had spent 2 decades building things that required violence to maintain stood with his forehead against hers, and neither of them was afraid. Not of the other, not of the silence, not of the weight of what they'd been through or the uncertainty of what came next, or the specific complicated math of 2 people who had arrived at each other through the worst versions of their lives, trying to build something in the aftermath. The tea had gone cold. She didn't move to fix it. He didn't move at all. They stood there in the February light and let the evening come in around them, slow and unhurried, the way evenings came in places where no one was watching for what the dark might bring. The letter came on a Thursday. Lucia opened it at the kitchen table with Sofia across from her, and Matteo leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, pretending to be less interested than he was, which was one of the things she'd learned about him that she found genuinely funny and had never told him because she was still deciding how to use the information. She read it once. She set it on the table. She looked at Sofia. Sofia looked at her with the clear-eyed attention of a woman who had already decided this was going to be good news and was simply waiting for the formality of it to complete. "Well?" Matteo said from the doorway. Lucia looked at him, looked at the letter, looked back at him. "I'm in," she said. Sofia made a sound that was possibly the most undignified sound Lucia had ever heard her grandmother make, which was saying something, and pushed herself up from the table and put her arms around Lucia with the strength of a woman for whom love expressed itself physically and practically and without qualification. Over Sofia's shoulder, Lucia looked at Matteo. He was still in the doorway. He hadn't moved. But his face had done the full thing again, the thing that went all the way through, that had nothing managed about it, 3 seconds of complete exposure before the containment came back up. She held the 3 seconds, filed them, kept them in the place where she kept the things that were true. Outside the window, the February garden waited for spring with the patience of things that understood that the right conditions eventually arrived. The light was going gold. The ocean was doing its work. A town of 4,000 people was going about the ordinary business of a Thursday afternoon with the comprehensive indifference of places that didn't know they were the setting for anything in particular. They were just a house on the north end. A woman with a letter and a healed shoulder and an application she'd been afraid to submit for 3 years. A man learning to cook in a kitchen that didn't require violence to stay warm. An old woman with better hips and a new cast iron pan and absolute magnificent certainty about what she was planting in spring. The rest was just weather. And they had learned, all 3 of them, in their different ways, through their different costs, that weather could be waited out, that the after arrived eventually, that you just had to be willing to move toward it, even when the gun was coming up, even when the math was bad, even when the safest thing was to hold still and wait for someone else to decide the direction. Sometimes you moved anyway. Sometimes moving was the whole answer.